The ideal family, a loving mother and father, a kind-hearted sister and a son who is the perfect student, destined to join the elite of Japanese society with his intelligence. That was, until he violently killed both of his parents in front of his sister, shocking the world and setting the boy down a path he will never return from. A bad omen that is best avoided at all costs because of the ruin he brings to everything he touches. We all have martial arts and fighting series that we love dearly. Ippo, Holy Land, Baki. You know the list goes on. Stories that provide us with main characters that are relatively easy to root for, especially when faced with the ultimate challenge. The David versus Goliath moments in those stories play on our desire to root for the underdog, coupled with personalities easy to admire or resonate with, and you get a formula for stories capable of motivating and inspiring with the fighting spirit. But what if we were to flip the David versus Goliath script, still keeping the underdog aspect but completely reversing the morality of the two roles, making Goliath a proud warrior and a role model, and David we make the most detestable human to ever exist on the face of the planet. This is what we get for a portion of a manga called Shamo, a martial arts manga that, due to its dark premise and even darker main character, Ryo Narushima, is like a stain that stands out amongst anything else in its genre. Written by Izo Hashimoto and drawn by Aiko Tanaka, the manga has 2 parts, but altogether is 334 chapters, providing a series that is a bit of a headache given that it feels like 2 people were working on this and they couldn't come to an agreement, sometimes striking gold and other times dropping the ball for seemingly no reason. But it also provides an uncomfortably interesting main character that explores someone who is searching for themselves in places you shouldn't be looking, and who can easily be seen as the most vile protagonist in all of manga. You ever wish you could just make your own anime character and then actually talk to them? I don't know if any of you do, but well, now you can. This video is sponsored by Polybuzz, an app where you can create your own unique character chatbot and have full conversations with it. You can build anyone you want: hero, villain, waifu, demon lord, doesn't matter. And if you can imagine it, you can make it. With that being said, since I know my beloved audience and y'all being some sick freaks, do not make one of me. I repeat, do not make one of me. Over 10 million people have already downloaded it, and there are more than 20 million characters living inside of this app. It's honestly insane. You can do some pretty funny stuff, I imagine, and heck, who knows, maybe it'll be useful for some video I do in the future. So if you're feeling creative, download Polybuzz using the link in the description or the pinned comment, and use Mask33 to show some love. And hey, if you do make something cool, feel free to share it, but not with me. Once again, that's code MASK33. You just put it in right here. The story begins with Ryo going to prison for what is revealed to be parricide. Although he only spends 2 years in prison for this insane crime, those 2 years would prove pivotal in the development of a demon in the body of a man. Just 2 chapters into the manga, he is sexually abused and driven into a corner, a behavior that clearly marks him, as we see once he's out of this hellhole. He also suffers through multiple attempted murders, beatings, severe bullying, and pretty much torture via isolation in the dark, but is able to survive, because while in prison, he learns martial arts from Kurokawa, a man that attempted to murder the Prime Minister of Japan. This is one of the positive qualities of Ryo that makes part of his character all the more tragic. His ability to learn due to his incredible intelligence and dedication to his craft makes me believe that he would have been successful in any field he pursued. However, the circumstances in which he learned martial arts comes from a place of survival. While others in the normal world might learn it for sport, to Ryo this is a way to avoid death. Combat sports also brings out the true nature in people. There's no place to hide when everything is on the line. On top of showing the flaws with reformation centers, in this very early part of the story, one might have some sympathy for Ryo, since one might be expecting a justification, possibly a plea of self-defense when it comes to the murder of his parents, the revelation that they were extremely abusive, and were about to kill Ryo for real, a big unfortunate nuanced misunderstanding that brought him to jail, a character that is turned into a monster instead of a person being born as one. Right? No, not really. The series doesn't show anything when it comes to this, outside of bits and pieces, only hinting that Ryo did feel trapped by overbearing and overprotective parents, but more so as an indication of his dark, perverse mind existing since he was young, not a bad household. So self-defense is not at all what happened. He is described often as someone who has never known love and is truly alone, even though his sister was there before he killed their parents, whatever. Even if you wanted to say the parents drove him to insanity, which is how Ryo feels, he could have just ran away. Because if you were desperate enough to kill 2 people, you were surely desperate enough to run away. I think this early part of the story shows how prisons aren't really adequate for reforming a disturbed youth, and in this case only aggravated an individual who by all signs is shown to be sick to the core. So one can only feel somewhat sympathetic in retrospect when it comes to what he dealt with in prison, but all of his actions as soon as he leaves jail make him detestable to a degree that words fail to capture. Sadly, after my Griffith video, I am very familiar with individuals who perform the most absurd level of mental gymnastics to justify characters like this, as if justifying them morally makes them better characters. It's okay if they're evil with certain human aspects one can see are present. Trying to interpret Ryo purely as a victim doesn't work. In fact, he will spend the rest of the series going into absurd lengths never to be victimized. He isn't helped at all by most people that surround him who only wish to gain things through Ryo's ability, caring little to steer him into a good path, but the series falls apart if you try to absolve him. Shamo, as it pertains to Ryo, works when you don't just see it as black and white. Every 5 chapters for the first half of this manga, I felt like JR talking about Triple H, since by the time he leaves jail, he has murder on his hands already, but it's once he returns to normal civilization that it becomes clear that multiple life sentences were needed. Because if killing your parents to preserve your personality leads to this, oh boy. While Ryo is a character that taps into a very human desire to survive, the power he gains through martial arts only feeds his darker desires, his need for power, his insatiable lust. Committing countless acts of assault relentlessly instigates violence, and even goes as far to sexually assault innocent women, despite that happening to him, and witnessing it happen to another woman that cared for him. Look, I'm all for evil being portrayed as evil. It's a fine line between being explicit to prove a point in its ugliest form, and then just being edgy, which Shamo jumps between both of those things. But surely you could have come up with a better name for a chapter. The most sickening case is, okay, how do I paint the picture of what this is? Okay, y'all remember when Kurt Angle was obsessed with Booker T's wife? This is literally that, but if Vince McMahon wasn't held back by TV restrictions. Ryo gets into a fight versus Naoto, the star fighter in the country, by tracking down his lover, forcing himself on her, and calling the guy to get inside his head, and so that Naoto would finally accept the fight. It is clear that he is repeating the abuse that was done to him while in prison, and this is a character we are meant to hate. Later on in the series, it is revealed that he got her pregnant, and she had to abort the child. Quote, "You took your parents' lives with your own hands. Cold-hearted beast. You also killed your first son." This is all within 66 chapters of a 330 chapter series. What makes Ryo odd is he does show care for his sister that he has been trying to find, and there are many characters in the series that enable him for their own personal gain, adding to the discussion of human depravity, but also showing that Ryo is capable of introspection and self-awareness, making his actions all the more terrifying. Even though the story describes him and he is given every evil nickname under the sun, the ugly truth is Ryo is no devil. He is a human being, and this is what humans can be capable of. It's uncomfortable to imagine that the most evil humans we can think of can be capable of love and guilt, since that makes it harder to box them in and pass judgment. Flipping the script by putting this type of character in the role of protagonist for us to observe closely, and having each of his opponents be the type of heroes we would cheer for. Even before the Naoto fight, Ryo has a history of using dirty, underhanded tactics, and all types of cheating in order to win. A spit in the face to what martial arts represents, using the desire to survive and the original purpose of martial arts in a more primitive era to satiate his unrelenting bloodlust and keep his soul from being killed, even though he doesn't realize the poison that is slowly killing him because of the path that he has chosen. Coupled with the desire to never be weak again, and that the only way to survive in the world is to be strong. His actions are proven valid in his sick mind, and he can rise above any sort of standard in society as long as he wins, immersing you into the story by making you feel hatred for a character you can't take your eyes away from. Every person he interacts with suffers because of himself, whether it's ending the career of an honest fighter who is providing for his family, putting a man in a coma, or failing to grow from any of the experiences he has, instead being a violent echo of the evil he experiences. On an island to train for a fight, he has a woman trapped, and when he isn't covering himself in blood and training in the dark, he is once again forcing himself on another individual. Most of the actions that condemn Ryo are in the first 100 or so chapters of the series. The rest is him unwilling to repent, viewing himself as irredeemable, and watching those around him fall apart as he himself kind of starts the same process over and over again. It would be incorrect to say that he is a mindless character. If anything, his self-awareness is well on display, and even seems sad by putting Naoto in a coma and running away. Yeah, he forced himself on the guy's girl, took steroids for their fight, and then in the rematch, put him in a coma. That part could be argued as accidental, and it was also a fight to the death, but interestingly enough, Ryo did not wish to kill Naoto. The arc after that is a strange one, since it feels disconnected from the rest of the series, happening after the second fight between Ryo and Naoto and before his fight with Toma. But the beginning of this arc does put on display Ryo's desire to survive no matter what, embodying the name of the series itself, Shamo, meaning gamecock, a rooster bred for fighting, and taking part in these fights and becoming a male prostitute as a way to gain money, encountering an old man that trains him in chi and presents the idea to Ryo of living a peaceful life, something that feels like a legitimate possibility, especially when Ryo plays an instrument. And you wonder if after his mistakes and falling from the top of the fighting world, if there will be an attempt to leave the dark and be a better man. Unfortunately, that chance is taken from him, and then it feels like that arc didn't exist afterwards, other than the ghost of this guy appearing. From that point onwards, the series fails to capitalize long-term on some super important ideas it presents outside of Ryo's darkness, only creating moments where you realize what kind of a pathetic existence he lives in, even though he mostly has himself to blame for that. The story feels like a disjointed mess when it comes to its plot and pacing, which ultimately affects the clarity of the messages. Really amazing 10 out of 10 stretches, and then interesting ideas that are poorly executed or don't have lasting impact, making a healthy chunk I spent reading this feel pointless. On one hand, I thought it was remarkable how the series does so well with its three major fights, being Ryo vs Naoto 1 and 2, and Ryo vs Toma, that I had to catch myself rooting for the underdog once I immediately remembered who this individual was, asking the question of who is right, and then if a character like this can be saved, and what kind of atonement can exist for such an individual, who actively rejects any opportunity to repent, since he has already given up on himself. The answer to that question that this manga ultimately provides, and rightfully so in this case, is fuck no. Ryo is a rage-filled animal who lashes out on everything he can get his hands on, as if he despises his very existence and knows no other way to live but further isolates himself in his sins. His sister resurfaces as an important part of his character after the first Naoto fight, seeming to be the only person he cares for and did things for until the final arc. Not saying this to justify anything. Fuck this guy, but it is worth mentioning there are legitimate moments where you wonder if there is any hope, and it gets you thinking about the fear that drives this character. Shamo presents a character with moments that are not meant to absolve him, but remind us that he is human. These are the stretches of the story that show Shamo at its strongest, flipping the script on its head and making us observe an individual worthy of the devil title, fighting against people we wish to see win. Thematically, the three fights Ryo vs Naoto 1 and 2 and Ryo vs Toma knock it out of the park. One who has to preserve his light to protect what he stands for, but just like Ryo wishes to rise above his struggles through fighting, and the other an angel, the beauty of fighting in the flesh, wishing to save Ryo, but ultimately falling short. The fights itself, the character exploration during these fights, mixed with the religious symbolism, and then you add the complete switch of the normal roles we see in a fighting series, man, this is some excellent shit. Toma is a very interesting character, but plot-wise, he feels forced, as if there was something missing from his character that would explain his desire to save Ryo. Regardless, I love that fight. Sadly, Ryo vs Naoto is set up for a trilogy that never happens, and Ryo vs Toma reaches a tragic conclusion, but it still felt like more was supposed to happen there as well, or at least I would have preferred Toma to build himself up again, or perhaps have a sequel fight with Ryo instead of the two characters we got fighting Ryo in the end. Once again, giving very powerful and confrontational moments about what a hateful heart can create at his absolute worst, and the torment that comes with it, forcing us, as the audience, to see that Ryo is capable of feelings, despite our wish to box him in as purely evil, but then failing to take this emotional spine of the series as it pertains to the two most important characters outside of Ryo to its natural conclusion. We'll wrap things up with characters like his sensei Kurokawa, and bring back other characters from the past, some of which you might have even forgotten, but but it's odd the same isn't done, especially with Naoto, and you could argue Tomo wasn't needed after their fight, so I'm not as hung up on that one. Had Naoto died when Ryo visited him in the hospital bed, then we're having a different conversation, but Naoto is seen rehabbing and pushing for the long-awaited third fight. Then I was given a very important piece of context as it pertained to the creation of Shamo. Remember earlier in the video when I mentioned how this manga felt like two people couldn't agree what to do with the series? Given that it feels like two people were working on this and they couldn't come to an agreement. Well, it turns out that was actually the case. That explains so much, since I was getting concerned that I was reading the equivalent to oil and water at times and it was just a me thing. Turns out the artist sued the writer for 150 million yen in a copyright lawsuit back in 2007, stemming from creative disagreements over what to do with the series, and the artist took over after its hiatus. With all due respect, his art is fantastic, top tier shit. But he should have just stuck with the art. As a series, I already felt it struggled with pacing and keeping the story focused. If I were to isolate the best of Shamo, I would wholeheartedly agree with those who vouch for it as a masterpiece, but I can't ignore all of the stuff in between, and the ending. I can see the idea that Shamo is going all in with subverting the typical things in a martial arts series, going as far as to deny the final battle between two rivals even. As a concept, that sounds beautifully tragic, but when you actually read the fucking manga, it isn't executed in a way that conveys said concept. But if not, it just reads as if the artist turned author completely forgot about it. The final arc is a mix of rushed in terms of the time we spend with Ryo reflecting on his life. Although we get some very good scenes, but it felt like more was supposed to happen. Unfinished plot lines, especially with Naoto, who's being set up to face Ryo again, and instead we get these two whack-ass characters, culminating in an ending that is fitting for Ryo and his sins, but sullied by a poorly executed plot. Ryo finds a girl who he connects with via her art, and helps her escape her father, a reminder of the type of parent that Ryo freed himself from. The father contracts these two to take care of Ryo and bring his daughter back home. Ryo in this part of the story has calmed down quite a bit, but his reputation precedes him, leading to a fight with these two, ultimately leaving Ryo crawling to his inevitable death. I'm a sucker when it comes to fairy tales being told within a story to symbolize what is happening in the actual story, but great symbolism in this case feels like duct tape on a cannonball-sized hole in a ship. Shamo is a hit-or-miss manga, since I'm sure for some, the great moments of the series outweigh the lows, and I can appreciate what it addresses when it comes to evil, society as a whole, he who performs, and he who is on the receiving end. It shows the path of a character that breaks the norms of what fighting manga can do with the main character, and how evil is presented often in manga. But being different is enough to get me interested, but that alone isn't enough to keep me satisfied with everything else, ultimately making Shamo more interesting in isolated stretches, and as a discussion piece, more than a series worth reading from the start to the end. He had me skeptical, then really had me, then lost me for a bit, but hey, you had me again, and then you fucking lost me just to have me for like the last 5 chapters. My feelings largely remain the same when I did the reread for this video. Again, the ending as it pertains to Ryo when you ignore what caused it is a great scene. Finally, with the chance to live a life of atonement and no longer be alone, to experience love and accept it for once. But that would not be a deserved ending for a man like that. He would need another 200 chapters worth of atonement to pull that ending off. He dies the way he lived, in the wilderness, alone, refusing to be looked down on to the bitter end. He is no more than an ant crushed in the wild, a human who dove headfirst into his own darkness to find himself, but tragically, forgetting how easy it is to get lost in the dark. A really bold idea for a character in a series, ultimately hurt by a lack of clear and consistent direction. Still, a fitting end for one of, if not the most vile and evil main character in manga.